Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami. We're talking these days about the path of discipleship, this line of gurus, how we can be more in tune, what their role is, just various interesting things. We'll see how it unfolds. So let us start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahasaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. We offer our lives in service and devotion to your cause of self-realization for all. We are your children. We rely upon your love and your guidance. Walk with us. Speak in our hearts and minds. Help us to move through this world as you would have us be, joyous, giving, free. Om. Peace. Amen. Well, I was just thinking about the path, this particular path, and I wanted to go to these words in Autobiography of a Yogi. And I know in the course of these broadcasts, I've actually specifically read these words before, so at the risk of repeating myself, but many of us have read Autobiography of a Yogi more than once, and I think more than one reading is warranted. This is the chapter 33 of the book. 33 is a nice auspicious number. It's called Babaji, Yogi Christ of Modern India. This book is really heavy. I think this book is as heavy as Light Bearer. I'm going to, no, no, Light Bearer is still heavier, but Yogananda's book, at least I'm in fairly good company. Okay. The Maha Avatar, this is referencing Babaji, is in constant communion with Christ. Together they send out vibrations of redemption and have planned the spiritual technique of salvation for this age. The work of these two fully illumined masters, one with the body and one without it, is to inspire the nations to forsake suicidal wars, race hatreds, religious sectarianism, and the boomerang evils of materialism. Babaji is well aware of the trend of modern times, especially of the influence and complexities of Western civilization, and realizes the necessity of spreading the self-liberations of yoga equally to the West and in the East. That there is no historical reference to Babaji need not surprise us. The great guru has never openly appeared in any century. The misinterpreting glare of publicity has no place in his millennial plans. Like the Creator, the sole but silent power, Babaji works in humble obscurity. Great prophets like Christ and Krishna come to earth for a specific, spectacular purpose. They depart as soon as it is accomplished. Other avatars like Babaji undertake work which is concerned more with the slow evolutionary progress of man during the centuries than with any one outstanding event of history. You know, as I read that, I'm remembering another passage, and if I can find it quickly, I'll read it. If I can't, I'll just start talking. So you're going to just get to sit and enjoy while I try to find it here. No, that's not what I want. Just a moment. Oh, here it is. Here, Swami's writing about, in the same way, too, the soul develops the gravitational pull to form meaningful and lasting relationships with other souls, gradually in its outer life, and others with whom it is spiritually compatible, form great families of souls that return to Earth or to other planets to work out their salvation. I'm going to skip a little. The stronger the family, the greater its attraction of new souls. As spiritual stars, such great families become powerful for the general upliftment of mankind. Like stars, too, they then draw planets of less evolved families. Here's the actual line I'm looking for. Such families of spiritual souls and spiritual seekers led by great gurus are like mighty nations. To them is given the real task of guiding the human race, not the way governments do by official ordinances, but by subtler spiritual influence. To them is given the real task of guiding the human race. Such families are like mighty nations. They guide the human race not in the way governments do by official ordinances, but by subtler spiritual influence. And these are very, 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 very important truths to keep in mind in the time that we're living in. I'm an American. I've resided only in America. I speak only English. I've had the privilege of traveling a great deal, and I know people all around the world, and I travel with Ananda. Well, with Ananda, I would say to Ananda around the world. I'm not an adventure traveler. I've never traveled for its own sake. I've always traveled, almost always, of course, I vacation like anyone else. But most of my travel has been in the context of Ananda. But it has given me a very international experience of life. So in that sense, I'm not narrow. But I'm American, and this is being recorded July 2020, and America is having a unique experience in terms of our government, the direction of our government, our reverence for our own traditions, and for those who are more accustomed to a different kind of energy existing in this country. To say the least, it's quite disconcerting. And there's no guarantee whatsoever that it's going to change. And all over the world, because of this pandemic and because of what feels to me, I tend to feel like just on the outside edge of my own consciousness is this shadowy force, which is just looking to break through. Insecurity and nervousness is very natural. But then we read that Babaji and Jesus are working together. You know, Babaji is the ever-living Himalayan master. Many times when people read Autobiography of a Yogi, they actually forget Yogananda, but Babaji really intrigues them. And the statement is made here that Babaji is one of those, and by no means the only, but he's one of those souls that has dedicated himself. His task is for the course of millennia. And so this whole line of masters, being one of these spiritual nations, to them is really given the task of running this world. You know, not by ordinances like governments do, but by subtle spiritual influence. Now, you know, the theme that I've been starting here and working with is discipleship. And yesterday I talked a lot about just that, how the force of the masters is constant, and the fact that we feel it to be intermittent is not because the masters are intermittent, but because our ability to receive their energy is intermittent. Now, intermittent on the conscious level, because much of our life happens on levels that we're not fully aware of. Sometimes we glimpse it in dreams, sometimes we sense it in meditation, but then the preoccupations of this world will take us over. But we ourselves really don't know where the influences are coming from and how we are being transformed, which is why it's always folly to try to evaluate yourself, because you don't even know what the test is half the time. We don't even know what success is. It has to be measured against our own capabilities. Swamiji famously once spoke about someone who was struggling. He said, well, they're doing very well considering who they are. And I know I've been in situations where I would have to say that, I think he or she is doing very well. Now, if you measure them against perfection, it looks like there's a lot of space. But if you measure them against their own progress in relation to their own delusions, people can be doing marvelously well when they're still struggling or underwater. There's a very important fact that was presented by Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce was well known because he was a psychic of a very high order. Psychic meaning he could access other dimensions of reality. He would actually go into a more or less of a trance, and then he would read realities that were not aware, that you couldn't access with the rational mind. And he lived. He lived in the middle of the last century. I'm not quite sure how long he lived, but over time, a huge organization. His many thousands of readings have all been organized. And so there's an entire section of past life readings he did for people who were with Jesus, which in and of itself is just wonderful. But one of the consistent things he said, and he was reading people in the 1950s and the 1960s, he would say, you were with Jesus. Not you were St. Paul, St. Peter, but you were there. You were in Jerusalem. He walked by you. Now, you all have heard me say this before because I repeat it to myself a lot. You had some actual moment when you connected with Jesus, and everything in your life since then, more than 2,000 years of multiple incarnations, has been guided by that touch. So just as the great star of a great spiritual family is a nation that is running the world, not by governments do, but by subtle spiritual influence. So our lives are being run by subtle spiritual influence. Whether it was one moment in the company of an avatar, like being with Jesus, or Kriya initiation, or that the act of taking on discipleship, or just the resolution in your own heart, whether your spiritual life has taken clear form or not, I am a truth seeker. I'm committing myself to finding the truth, the search for eternal verities, as Master describes it in the first sentence here. And that these forces are like a pulse that's working on us. And even if we don't know it, it's like delusion is being carved away from us. And even more profoundly, once we have accepted the idea of being a disciple, and that I have to speak from that level, and think for a moment about the purification ceremony that Swami Kriyananda created for us some 30 years ago. I have a whole, maybe 1 or 2 days, I think, in this series in which I just talk about the purification ceremony, in which we go before the Ananda light bearer. I seek purification by the grace of God. And the light bearer answers. The Master says, open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life. Now just think about that. If one has ever done that or ever longed to do that, I will open my heart to you and you will take charge of my life. Now, just because after that we go on seemingly in the same way, we have no idea. But it's like we've put ourselves on the train. I was talking about that image also. We've stepped onto the train of self-realization and have committed ourselves as deeply as we're able to commit ourselves. And this power is the constant force in our own lives. If we're, anxiety and insecurity, concern about the future is the most natural way to feel right now. But Babaji and Christ together are aware of what's going on, and they're working for our salvation. And this great spiritual nation is actually guiding the show by subtle spiritual influence. So we have, and the further story that that is told in autobiography, and Swami Kriyananda tells repeatedly in the Festival of Light that we do every Sunday. Jesus appeared to the great master Babaji. The lights on my high altar, the high altar of inner communion, are burning low and are ill attended. So Jesus, who has been the avatar responsible for the spiritual direction of the West, meets Babaji, who in the form of Krishna, and in his incarnation as Krishna, magnetizes the East, and in his everlasting role as Babaji, continues to work for the salvation. Jesus says, we have a problem. And our problem is that though the candles are still lit on the lower altars of good works, taking care of mankind, serving the poor, people have forgotten that inner communion, in other words, an actual change of consciousness and behavior that springs from a transformation of consciousness, is what we're really seeking. Right action, because we know that right action is appropriate and helpful to us, is certainly a great benefit, though still lit on the lower altar of good works. But the nobler taper of inner communion with the Lord we're not paying attention to it. And as a consequence, the vibration of the planet is weaker, because the real power comes when we consciously attune to that subtle force. And so then Jesus says, let us together in Christ's love, in the divine realization, do something about it. And thus this line of masters came to earth. Now, some of you are familiar with this story because you hear it often, but familiarity should not weaken appreciation. So we need to be very careful to actually think about that. And then this ray of grace, thus a new ray of grace was sent to earth for the salvation of mankind. Babaji, Lahiri Mahasaya incarnates. How does any of this take place? I have no idea. There's a beautiful story told about Ramakrishna, that when Ramakrishna, who was an avatar who lived in the 1800s, and he brought some great souls with him. Most famous is Swami Vivekananda, but there were other great souls who came with him. And they tell this story of a vision. Now, where did this come from? I don't know, but Ramakrishna, I believe himself told it, or Vivekananda told it, where somewhere in the divine realms, there is a baby, and this baby is the fully realized being, Ramakrishna, this unique bubble of divinity that is going to once again assume human form for the sake of mankind. So this baby goes to some part of creation where 7 great sages are sitting in profound meditation. And as a baby, he gets their attention. And he says to them, I have to incarnate. You have to come with me. And so that is described how Vivekananda, at least, perhaps I have some of the details wrong, but I know Vivekananda, at least, this deep meditating sage, and the baby insisted that he come with him because we have a job to do. Master remarked once, Lahiri Mahasaya had it easier, he said. During his whole lifetime, during his whole incarnation, there were no wars. Master said, already in my lifetime, there have been 3. World War I, World War II, and the Korean War that Master had to live through. And with his sensitivity to human suffering, and Master himself tells stories, he was in all bodies. So the horror of war and the individual suffering was not something he could close his heart to. He had to live through it. He had to live through the agony of all these souls. And Lahiri Mahasaya had it easier than he did, because Lahiri just was able to sit in a peaceful world and meditate and initiate people into Kriya. Where does such a statement come from? I don't know. Master himself was a warrior, as Ferdinand as Ferdinand III. Almost his entire adult life was spent at war. As William the Conqueror, he was constantly having to battle to hold what he conquered, to make it right for where he was going. So there's just this extraordinary, and I find marvelous to contemplate picture. So Jesus appears to Babaji. They know what's going on in the world. They know that a new power has to begun. A new direction has to be set. And again, we're talking about millenniums. We're talking about centuries. So when you think about the influence of Jesus, how much showed in his lifetime? How long was it before it took form? How long was it before the life of Buddha began to take form? Ramakrishna came, and Ramakrishna's, well, he had magnificent mission in many ways, but he declared all paths are equal. And what Ramakrishna did, he practiced every path. He was a Hindu, he was a Christian, he was different sects of Hinduism. He was devoted to Radha, he was a Shivite, he was an Advaitist, he was a devotee. And he would just take up the sadhana of every path. He was Hanuman. He went through a period of his sadhana when he was Hanuman. He took his garment and he made it like the tail of a monkey. He spent time in trees. He ate only fruit. I mean, you think people didn't think he was crazy? People thought he was crazy. I mean, later, of course, they all become revered, but at the time, it's not so easy to take. When he became Radha, he just completely like a woman. And he was so much like a woman, he could go into the harems and the women just accepted him as one of them. He was completely female because he became Radha. And he would follow each one until he realized God. So then he could say, not just theoretically or in a kind of theological broad-mindedness, he would say every path leads to the same goal, whichever path you follow. And that was an extraordinary revolution when Ramakrishna said that. Kali Yuga ended and Dwapara proper began in 1900, and he died just before that. But he redirected. Now, how many people on the planet know about Ramakrishna at all? What to speak of knowing that he did that? But it is these great spiritual nations that are really in charge. And so Master's born in 1893. Ramakrishna died, I believe, just before that. His life overlapped with Vivekananda, but they were working in parallel. They weren't operating as one ray together, but they were parallel rays going out to move the planet like this, And so Babaji calls, Lahiri incarnates, Sri Yukteswar incarnates, Master incarnates, and the power of Christ is always there. Swamiji became persuaded by the end of his life that Master, in fact, was the reincarnation of Jesus, which Swamiji spoke without qualifying that statement at the end of his life. He felt that was true. So here we have this family, this great nation, again, coming onto this planet here. But each incarnation is really very short compared to the gradual change of yugas, the gradual shifting of the whole consciousness of a planet, which, of course, only shifts our consciousness if we're in tune with that spiritual energy. You can't merely cling to the edges of earth and become evolved. You have to individually receive that energy. But we're bathed, even as we sit here right now, even though we have the illusion that these more or less capable individuals who have the karma to rise to high office in their particular nations and seemingly hold a lot of power over our fate are actually just playthings in the hands of the gurus. And those of us who are aware of self-realization as the reality, well, we must be very vigilant in our inward life. And even though I pay a little bit of attention to what's going on in the world, Swamiji paid attention. He said, as the leader of a large organization with responsibility for many people, it would be irresponsible of me not to pay attention to what's going on in the world because it will affect us. We need to make intelligent decisions for the short term as well as the long, if we have responsibilities that way. But in our hearts, attunement with the masters really demands that we believe, that we develop deep faith in what is really happening here. This is the path of a disciple. The path of a disciple is to recognize that there is a higher wisdom that I need to be receptive to. To become a disciple, which, as I was speaking yesterday, to be a disciple comes, the word disciple comes before the word guru, the way Master wrote it. Because to be a disciple is to realize there is a profound and important limit to what I can understand on my own. And the paradox of being a disciple is that one has to become very strong-minded and very willing to stand firmly by my own understanding and separate myself from the wildly deluded common way of thinking. But simultaneously with that profound inner understanding, part of that profound inner understanding is that there is greater wisdom than mine. And my first interest is always to hear truth. And it's not to assert my truth, it's to attune to truth. And when we read Autobiography of a Yogi, or when we read Swami's book, The Path, or when we read, and I don't mean to put myself in that company, but this is a book about Swami Kriyananda, and something happens inside our hearts, and we realize that these are not distant beings from me, but this ray of grace is running my life. And so once that thought is there, even in the abstract, that God is running my life, but when the longing is very deep, that I really wish to transform myself, I do not wish to go on and on in this delusory state, then it's well worth just contemplating, what does that mean? Babaji and Christ have planned the spiritual salvation of this age, that yoga communion with God, is the answer to everything that's happening. How does that influence my relationship to the entire world around me? And why am I afraid? Why am I insecure? Naturally, if some of the people who hold worldly power were really in charge, we're in pretty bad trouble. And we might still, everyone says, have to live through very tumultuous times. But living through tumultuous times with nobody in charge is quite different than holding Babaji's hand and Christ's hand with God in your heart and realizing that we are being led. We are not being driven. We are not being thrown off a cliff. This is what it is to be a disciple. Open your heart to me, the Master says, and I will enter and take charge of your life. Definitely worth a long meditation, isn't it? God bless you.